Dave, you have such a long-running legacy as a composer. Could you talk a little bit about your approach to scoring video games and whether or not that has changed over the years?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a formula, really. If somebody gives me a level to look at, I'll take a look at it and get a few ideas and start putting a few ideas down and then send it back for them for some further comment, really, and develop it like that. And that's really been the same all the way through. Right from the beginning, working on NES games to working on the Wii U.
Right.
It's always been the same for me, I believe.
Well, we're personally such great fans of your stellar work for the Donkey Kong Country games. What does that series mean to you, and how does it feel finally coming back to the musical world of Donkey Kong?
It's great. It's good to be back. I think one of the things that I missed at Rare when we got taken over by Microsoft was the fact that we'd probably never do a big title like Donkey Kong Country again.
Right.
So it's been an absolute pleasure to be working on the series once again. I've really enjoyed doing it.
Well, I mean, I'm sure all the gamers out there we're all so eager to hear that soundtrack. Well, I can already tell you, Dave, there's a lot of people that are so excited to hear that you're coming back. So
That's great. Thank you. I mean, for me as well, I'm very excited to be back and working on Donkey Kong again.
So you've worked at Rare from 1985 all the way to 2009, such a long amount of time. You were their first in-house composer. How did you get the job at Rare?
Let me see. I was working at a music shop in a city called Leicester in the UK. It's very central. And what happened? Yeah, two men walked in off the street and they wanted to have a Yamaha CX-5 computer demonstrated, and I think there was a Korg Poly 800 synth at the time that I was using as the controller, and I'd set it up, and they were very interested. So all of a sudden, one of them said, "Oh, can we talk upstairs?" And I thought, "Oh, great, we've made yet another sale of this system." And so we went upstairs to the office, and it was Tim Stamper, and he offered me a job there and then. So that's how it all started.
Wow, it really is those little moments that really change your whole life. It's crazy.
Isn't it? Absolutely. You never know what life's going to throw at you So it was, yes, it was, although you don't see it at the time, it was one of those life-changing moments.
Definitely. That's really interesting. Well, getting back to your compositions, your music is frequently praised for being atmospheric and for heightening the integration between music and sound. However, you also seem to be able to have a balance between ambience and very powerful and often catchy melodic material. What is your writing process, and how are you able to strike that balance?
I don't think I really have a preconceived idea of what I'm going to do. I just get down and look at the visuals and do what comes naturally, really.
Right.
I don't really analyze what I do. I just get on and do it.
So when you're coming up with a piece, is the melody usually the first thing that comes to you?
Not necessarily, no. I think I start off with the tempo and the pace of the gameplay at any particular point.
Right.
And then build from there. And then I think once I've got a foundation of that tempo and that rhythm, that's where the melodies start coming from. So it's probably rhythm first of all, to give the pace and the rhythmic content and how it bounces along, depending on the gameplay. And that's really where I'd start developing the melody.
That's so cool, especially when you think of the music for Donkey Kong, how it's so rhythmic oriented and how that rhythm is such an element even in the gameplay.
It is very much so. And again, that was developed a little more for the DKCTF that we've just done. So we've taken that perhaps an extra step, probably quite subtly, but I think you'll notice it really when you're playing the game, the way the rhythm integrates with the gameplay.
Well, could you talk a little bit about your relationship with Kenji Yamamoto and how you got involved in Tropical Freeze?
To do that, we have to go back to my last days at Rare.
Right.
So when I was leaving Rare, and I think it was on the last day, I'd had an email from Michael Kelbo just asking me what I was doing. Sadly, at that time, I was a few personal problems that I was resolving. So I didn't realize the gravity of the email that Michael had sent me at the time. So I had a few things to work out. So I left Rare. I'd started working on a different project for Sony at the time. And then when I'd got my brain back together and realized that, oh, Michael Kelby, I recognize that name. Of course, it was somebody who'd worked originally on the original DKC series. He'd come over with Nintendo and he worked worked with the integration and with Tim and Chris Stamper at the time. So we'd met at that stage. So really, from pretty much a few weeks after leaving Rare, I'd been in touch with Michael Kelber at Retro Studios, and we'd been in contact there, and that's how we developed that relationship, and then came to work on DKCTF.
Now, what was it like working for Retro Studios? Were there any similarities between Retro and Rare, and what was it really just like working at Retro?
There are many similarities in the way that they work as a team and they get excited about different ideas and bring it all together. It was very reminiscent, and it was good. It was a good feeling of almost being back at Rare, so to speak. It was a very similar pipeline of work, so it was almost familiar, but then it had moved on somewhat as well. Obviously, the tools that we use are a lot more sophisticated than they were at Rare.
Right. Now, did you actually have the opportunity to work with Kenji Yamamoto, or how did that work? Because I know that he did the previous game, Donkey Kong Country Returns.
Yeah, Kenji Yamamoto, Yamamoto-san, he has a sound group that works with him as well. So I think there are many composers or musicians and arrangers who'd worked on the previous score. I met Yamamoto-san over in Texas at one of the meetings, and he'd come over for a few days, and we would talked about the direction of the game and where we're going to go with it. And then later on in the project, Yamamoto-san and his sound group worked on some of the pieces in the game. I think that I really like what they do. I like the way they can take elements of the stuff that I'd done and integrate it into their stuff, and that was very clever the way they'd done that. Very inspiring.
It must be so cool for you all these years later to hear that material that you came up with in something like 1994, to hear it again with these better sounding instruments. It just must be so fun for you.
It was, yeah. I didn't realize the impact of that until the latter years of Rare, when there's a group of people online who OC Remix. I don't know if you've heard of them,
Oh, yes.
and that they do quite a lot of stuff, and it's very heartening to hear your stuff retold for the modern times. And again, with Yamamoto-san and his sound group, the fact that they're taking all of those original melodies and adapted them for a new game, it was very good, very heartening. So and good fun as well, good fun to listen to.
Well, that's great. I mean, we're just such big fans of the Donkey Kong Country series. What can players expect to hear from the musical palette of this new game? How is the music going to be similar, and what new things are going to be brought to the table? Because I know everyone's so excited that you're back in the composing chair again.
I think one of the good things about Yamamoto-san, and he reminded me of the way Nintendo approached their games and the way they like to take the legacy and the emotional things that attach people to games and introduce it or reintegrate it into modern games. So there's a bit of modern and there's a bit of the old, and it's the way they're fused together, really. So there's some new tunes, and there's some of the original tunes, and there's some that have been fused really between the two. So there's all sorts across the board, but the nostalgia is what Nintendo, they find that very important, and we've tried to incorporate this into DKCTF.
That's just fantastic. I can't wait to hear that soundtrack.
Yeah, from what we've heard so far from some of the trailers and some of the gameplay, it's just so exciting to hear you coming back to this world, but to hear it in a modern context. We just can't wait.
Yeah, because it's strange because there are some pieces of music that we've updated from the original SNES soundtrack, and the amount of processing power and instruments that we had to throw at it to make it sound reminiscent of the original score, it was quite surprising what we had to do that. So that was quite interesting, because I think these days we expect so much because we have all these virtual instruments that we have access to,
Right.
and everybody expects a certain amount of quality. So to recreate the old sounds but bring it up to date as well, and still have the essence of that sound, that was quite a challenge, but a very enjoyable one too.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because something we talk about on our podcast is the idea of the uncanny valley, where back in the Super Nintendo, it was so obvious that that wasn't real. So there is a kind of nostalgia to the sounds. But now that you have access to better sounding samples, I imagine it would be hard to find a balance of it does sound more real, but this is still colorful, imaginative music. So it still needs to have that whimsical quality. So I imagine that would be challenging.
It is a challenge because sometimes it is almost too easy to make it sound too real, and then you're losing the essence of really the game and the way it should play and the way it should sound. So yeah, we did have to think quite a lot about how we use those instruments and perhaps not make it sound too live, but there's quite a lot of
Right.
there's quite a lot of live elements in there that have been quantized to make it fit in.
And I think that it's really going to fit in this day and age because I think one of the things people forget is when they think back to Donkey Kong Country, they may initially think, oh, very colorful, playful, slightly goofy. But what I think is so interesting about the music is a lot of the music in those games are very serious and electronic and atmospheric. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that balance with kind of modern instrumentation because I think sometimes people forget that the music to that series was always taken fairly seriously in a way.
Yeah, it was, and I think looking back now, some of it was quite almost too serious, but it somehow worked with the gameplay. But there was always an underlying rhythmic background to it for it to sit on.
Right.
So I think that the elements did seem to work quite well together. But I don't think really it's the type of game that needs to be too serious.
Right.
So yes, that there are those themes there, but we've tried to keep it as light-hearted and as bouncy as possible. And I think that goes hand in hand with the graphics because they are very dynamic and they're very fun. So matching those two together is quite important.
Absolutely. That's so incredibly interesting. Speaking of Donkey Kong, going back to the original series, what were some of your musical influences for sort of creating the sound of Donkey Kong Country?
I listen to stuff, as I'm sure most composers do. I just listen to a bit of everything all the time, constantly.
Right.
I think the direction was taken really by the limited amount of memory that we had on the SNES. It only used 64K, and that the whole sound, including it wasn't MIDI data, but certainly the note data was also included in that 64K. So we had probably a float of about 56K of sounds that we could use. It used 80 PCM, so we roughly had 150K in real sample sizes. So it was a very limited sound palette, and it was a case of working with what we might be able to fit into the sound palette and using that and that dictated a lot of what we could use, which is why we went more for the electronic-y type of score, because we could make a good job of doing that.
How much control did you have on the Super Nintendo to choose the samples? Because I know a lot of that was customizable. Did you pick certain samples, or were you given a sample pack by Nintendo, or how did that work?
The SNES, as it came with the development kit, had a set of samples that Nintendo supplied for us. So I used some of those samples, but on the whole, most of it was custom samples that I'd created.
Oh, wow.
I'd got very into single cycle wave samples. So you're basically going down to the smallest unit of a sample, which would be one wave. It might only be 16 bits long. And I'd take that as the sound source and start combining those together to make different sounds. So we've gone right down to a very microscopic sample layer, really. Very introverted, really.
Well, I mean, the sound and the quality of the music for those Donkey Kong Country games, and I mean, even the graphics and the whole production of those games are really some of the best on the SNES. They're so advanced for that console.
Well, and I think what made that game so fresh when it came out, a big part of it was the music, because it wasn't doing what every other game was doing. There's something so signature and unmistakable about so much of your music, I would say. In your opinion, if you had to consider, what are some of the unique elements that make a Dave Wise video game tune, or at least elements that you think about when you're working on a piece?
Some of the things that made the original game work in the way that it did was because we didn't have MIDI. Everything was written in subroutines. So
Interesting.
we'd be pulling subroutines and adapting them to save space, and that was, I'm sure that was quite a big influence on the way the soundtrack was developed. So as for a David Wise soundtrack, again, it's really just look at the graphics and take it from there and use the tools I have in front of me to try and give the best music to suit the level, really.
Well, it's working for you. I mean, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure I'd know how to change it.
Absolutely. I mean, for us in particular, the soundtrack to that second game, Donkey Kong Country 2, is really just one of our absolute favorite soundtracks. The music is so good, and to me, I'm just so consistently impressed with how much music there is, and even as far as like how every level you have where when you die, there's almost a different arrangement of that little jingle depending on whatever musical palette is for that level. And I just thought that was so innovative and something that I feel like even most modern games don't go that far.
True. I mean, the reason they were all different is because we'd found a way to stack the memory, because we only had about 56K that we could use. We found a way of dropping in about 6K between levels. So we couldn't use the same tune because we might not necessarily have the same samples to hand until we went to the next level.
Huh. Mm-hmm.
And that was why. So we had to change the tune because otherwise we wouldn't be using the right instrument. So it was a good opportunity to adapt it for the sample palette that we had for each level.
That's so cool.
That's great. Well, moving along, after your days on the Super Nintendo, when you moved on to the N64, Diddy Kong Racing for the N64 was very different from the Donkey Kong Country series in the tone and the music. Can you talk about the approach of scoring a racing game and how that was different from something like the Donkey Kong Country series?
Well, clearly we're big fans of Super Mario Kart. Yes. And we were, being rare, we like to take the idea of established Nintendo games and try and rarefy them. So probably make them more Western.
Absolutely.
So the idea with the score with Diddy Kong Racing was to be even more Nintendo than Nintendo were. So to really grab the cliches that they
right.
They brilliantly get hold of, but even do it more so. So just try and make it everything cliched and defined even more than Nintendo did it. So that was really where we're trying to go with it.
It's so interesting that you say that because I feel like nowadays the modern Mario Kart games that come out, some of them may go back to Diddy Kong Racing because I feel like that elevated cartoonish quality of the music was so much fun, and I think it's funny to think that you were trying to do them, and who knows if nowadays they might be trying to do you. It's almost like this crazy cycle.
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, it'd be funny if that's what they were trying to do, but that's certainly what I was trying to do. But we were taking their lead, really, but just trying to do it more and exaggerate the cliches so much more than they'd already done. And I think that brings a certain quality to the game. And with a game like Mario Kart, you can do that because, the graphics are so fun, and you can almost caricature the sounds and the graphics to make them even more cartoony than they were. And as well with that score, it was more of a world tour as well. So we'd be going and taking influences from around the world. So from Spain, from the Middle East,
right,
from Hawaii, all of these different places. And we were just trying to hone in on those cliches.
Absolutely. Well, one thing I kind of want to get back to, you were the sole composer at Rare from 1985 to 1994, if I'm correct about that. Was there a lot of pressure? Because you were obviously working on a lot of games, and how did you sort of approach that really huge responsibility?
I was probably too young to realize it was such a big responsibility at the time. It was just good fun, as I said, I've been working in a music shop before, and if I wasn't working there, what was I going to do? So somebody was paying me to write tunes.
Getting paid to write your own music is so cool.
Absolutely. It was, so it was just a case of getting on with it. I mean, there were times when it was quite pressured because we had to get a game out. But some of those NES scores, they were written in a week. We did the whole lot, lock, stock, and barrel.
Speaking of that NES stuff, I'm a huge fan of your early work on the NES with games such as like RC Pro-Am, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Nightmare on Elm Street, Snake Rattle and Roll, and like many more. But what was your experience like working on the NES, and how did some of those hardware and voice limitations affect the nature of your composition?
Yes, it definitely influenced the composition because there weren't that many voices.
Right.
So you had to think very carefully about how the melody worked with the bass because really that's all we had. Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
we'd have melody, a middle line, and bass, but that was it. So it was basically there's a lot of suggestion in there to try and get the chords, and that would influence the melody somewhat as well.
Right.
So if you wanted, just to take an example, if you're going from a major into a major seven, then obviously the melody had to be reaching the seventh to make it work. So it was a very good way of, I suppose, learning how to compose for video games. There's no other option really, and it made you focus very much on the melody.
Right.
So it's probably very, very good training for the years ahead, really.
Absolutely. You know, that's one of the things that we enjoy about listening to your NES music and then going on to the Super Nintendos. We still hear that heart of it, but it's really fun to hear you with more voices. One thing I wanted to talk about is during your extensive time at Rare, what were some of the other roles that you played other than just a composer, maybe something more of an overseeing or supervisor role? And can you talk about your experience working on games in other capacities?
I think because I'd been there obviously on my own, then when we started employing people like Robin and Grant, then
Right.
yeah, there was that supervisory role just to get them started, really. But they were very, very capable. They'd only need a bit of a start, and off they'd go, and that was it. You could leave them to their own devices at that point. So it wasn't really too much of a supervisory role. It was just getting people started off in the right direction, and off they'd go, really, which is great because that meant I could concentrate on writing music, which is what I wanted to do,
Right.
without having to worry too much about what everybody else was doing. So that there was some, it's just making sure they've got the right kit, the right tools, pointing them in the right direction, and getting them going. And off we went.
Well, I kind of want to bring it back to that original Donkey Kong Country for the SNES. Now, Rare was not the studio that people expected to reboot a Nintendo franchise, but what's so crazy is that game was so critically acclaimed and loved by everyone that it sort of went on to spawn sort of a new era for Rare as far as all their successes, even into the N64. What was that project like, working on the original Donkey Kong Country? Was there a lot of pressure from Nintendo, and what was sort of the involvement between Rare and Nintendo?
I think what we have to do is go back slightly earlier than that. We have to go back just before we'd always been involved with Nintendo, but the bigger involvement happened when Tim had invested heavily in the computers that they were using, these American computers. They were very expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And we're at one of those kind of crossroads because the NES had died, really, because everybody was working on the Super NES, but we weren't bringing big titles out on the SNES at that point. So Tim and Chris invested in these machines that, by anybody's standard today, would have, it was make or break, really. They cost a fortune.
Right.
Red had put these tech demos. One was like a boxing thing using 3D pixels, and the other one was Donkey Kong.
Wow.
And I think it was really the boxing one. When that was on screen, it was like nothing else anybody had seen. And I think that excited a lot of people when they saw it, and that was very instrumental in getting the go ahead to work on the DKC franchise, or Donkey Kong franchise, and that's really how that bit started. So it was those tech demos of demonstrating that could work, and it did. It looked amazing even on the SNES, and I think that's what revitalized it. Also, you have to remember that we were in competition with the Genesis at the time, which
Right.
was almost more advanced than the Super NES. So by investing in these tools and this software and just throwing tons of time because those machines had to render all the graphics, and you'd leave them on overnight. And they just to come back in the morning and have a few renders done. It was that much
Mm,
processing time that was involved. So it was exciting because we all knew we were onto something that nobody else was doing, which is a great feeling. And of course, you can't mess that up. You know you've got something good, and you want to bring it out to market to be very impressive. And we were all very
right.
much aware of that.
Absolutely.
And also, whether you're involved in gameplay, whether you're involved in music or doing the graphics or the animation, everybody who works at Rare, and again everybody who works at Retro, they all want to get the very best out of the technology that we have at the time, and that was very noticeable, and that's what we're all trying to do. We were just trying to make it as good as possible and much better than what we saw everybody else doing at the time.
That's so interesting. I feel like your music really breathes such a life into those original three games and gave them such an infectious spirit that made people just have so much fun and want to keep playing.
Right.
When you first thought about, because I know you were talking earlier about your approach to scoring video games, when you first saw what the team at Rare was creating, how did that affect the way you wanted to approach scoring the music to the original Donkey Kong Country, and subsequently the style that those three games would take on? Because it was obviously quite different from what Nintendo was doing musically at the time.
When I first saw the demo for DKC, I saw the graphics on screen. I'd assumed that Nintendo, or somebody like Koji Kondo, who is very renowned as a composer even then, I
Right.
just assumed for some reason that he would be doing the music for such an important title. I didn't imagine that we'd be doing the music for that.
Right.
So as an interim, they'd asked me to write some demos for the jungle level, which was the working level that we were working on. So I wrote three pieces for that, and I presented them, and they said, "Okay, that's great. Can you just put them all together?" So you've got
Really?
one, which is why when you listen to the jungle theme,
Why it switches to the dun
Yeah,
dun
there's
dun
different
yeah,
dun
sections
there's
of
three
it.
dun
different
dun.
sections, and that's why. So I just put the three together, and off this demo went over to Japan. Anyway, somebody there must have liked it because it stuck.
That's crazy.
Dave, I know it was so long ago, but do you happen to remember when you first came up with the like arguably the most famous theme of Donkey Kong Country? Did it feel good when you came up with that? Did you realize how important that would be, or was it just another idea you came
It,
up
it
with?
was just another idea I'd come up with, really. So, I mean, we were listening to, obviously, yeah, there are so many kind of cliched jungle styles that were out there at the time. And it was a case of trying to take influences from all of them and come up with an original theme. Or it didn't need to be too original. There has to be some familiarity in there. It's got to sound like a jungle.
Right.
So it was definitely composition by taking lots of elements from different places and then putting your own spin on them. I'd have a melody, and you'd have something, and you'd come in the next day and you think, well, that's not quite right. And I like to percolate with melodies. I don't just like to write it and that's it. I like to write it, sit on it for a couple of days, and then come back to it and work on it and work on it and work on it until I've honed it down to something that I think breathes quite naturally, and that's the way I'd approach the melody, and that's very much the same with that. Which is, it took a long time to get it to work for me. So fortunately, it did. But it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. I was just doing what I thought was a demo for the tech demos to send over to Japan. I didn't realize it was going to be used on the game at that point.
Right.
Do you remember where in the process of making the first game did you compose Aquatic Ambiance, the swimming theme? Because that's arguably one of the most famous and well-loved themes of that first game. Was that something that was composed a little later on?
Not really. I did the jungle level first, and it was December of the year before the game came out. And my favorite synth at the time was called the Korg Wave Station, and that worked on the single cycle waves and just playing them in sequence. And I was trying very hard to recreate that on the SNES with a limited 64K memory.
Right.
So that's the technical side of it, and it was really trying to use that technology and emulating the Korg wave station, which is where the aquatic ambience comes from. And it just works on that bass line, which is literally 8 waveforms just in sequence going ding, 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 ding. And they were just the first 8 waveforms that I got, and that's how we got the bass line. And everything really came after that. So it was really experimenting with how far we could take that technology, because it wasn't just me. There were programmers working on that, and they were adapting the sound chip for me and writing special tools. It's always a team, creative process. Obviously I'm driving where it's going, but there are a lot of talented people there to make it happen as well.
Right, and then I know that in the third game, I know that Evelyn Fisher was involved as well as the composition. How did that work as far as you and her writing songs together for Donkey Kong Country 3?
Well, Evelyn Fisher wrote probably about 40% of the original DKC score as well, and Robin had written the track as well. So she was involved right from the word go, really.
Right.
When it came to number 3, it was really her game. I just wrote 5 of the tracks, I think, 4 or 5 of them. So number 3 was very much Evelyn's puppy, really.
I heard that you handled the Game Boy Advance port of Donkey Kong Country 3.
That's true, yes, absolutely.
So did you write new music for that game?
I wrote new music for it on purpose. It was a bit of a rock and a hard place. We're at the end of development with that game, and we only had 6 weeks left to do it. And it's a bit hard, that sound chip. It's very hard to get the most out of it. Now the original Super NES works on a TV screen. It's got a lot more bandwidth, sonic range, whereas on the Game Boy Advance you've got those. I think it's just one little speaker.
Right.
And very few samples work on that, and I couldn't adapt Evelyn's soundtrack quickly to make it work on the Game Boy Advance. So I made the executive decision that it would be easier to write a new score than it would be to try and adapt and recreate the original score. It would have taken far more than 6 weeks to do that with the.
That's so crazy.
So it seemed awesome. The only thing we could do in the time was to write a new score, but adapt it and specifically write it for that little speaker on the Game Boy Advance.
Because that Game Boy Advance is such a quirky little piece of hardware, because you have a mixture of some of those very, very compressed samples, but also that specific sort of synth sound chip kind of sound.
Was it kind of, did it almost feel like you were going back to your NES days working on that?
It was almost, but in some ways it was more compromised as well, because there was so little. If you worked on the SNES and then you're having to go almost backwards and try and recreate it with something that doesn't really work as well, it was very, very challenging. So a lot of the bass notes aren't there and would never be. Edwin liked to use a lot of pedal notes to create atmosphere, which worked brilliantly on the SNES.
Right.
But there's no way we could do that on the Game Boy Advance. You couldn't build the sense of drama that you get with those long string bass notes. The sense of anticipation wasn't there. And I found that the only way to suggest bass was to use piano sounds, which have got a lot of high frequency content. Because bass sounds, they were just completely lost, really. So it was different method of writing for that game, totally. And I think when people reviewed it, they were sad that Evelyn's original music wasn't in there. But I can't technically see how we'd have managed that and pulled it off
in 6 weeks.
Well, in 6 weeks, or even if we'd had a year, I think it would have been hard to recreate that and do it convincingly. So there was always
and then they would have been disappointed that it doesn't sound exactly like the SNES. It's hard to please
absolutely
everyone.
I was coming on to that. So it was a balance. So I think given the time limitations we had, that was definitely the best that we were the best solution at the time.
One thing I find interesting is for the second game on the Super Nintendo, Donkey Kong Country 2, I believe that was solely composed by you. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
There's probably a correlation between that fact and also that's our favorite Donkey Kong Country soundtrack.
You're very kind.
One thing that is so great about that is the pirate influence that it spreads to the entire musical score, the swashbuckling nature.
The jib jig.
Yeah, how early on was that established that this game was going to be pirate themed and that had to be in the music too?
Again, that comes down to a lot of Tim Stamper's influence. He loves boats, or he did at the time, and so having a nautical theme in the game was quite important, really, and it was driven by, again, a lot of the graphics, obviously, and the gameplay had that nautical theme in them. So we were just trying to do the same with the music and incorporate as much swashbuckling stuff as possible, which is always good fun. But again, it's a challenge as well. It can sound a bit corny, some sea shanty type thing. So it was trying to find a balance of it being fun without sounding ridiculous. So hopefully we managed that.
Oh, it was exquisitely done. Also, something that I just absolutely love about that soundtrack is sort of the integration between sound effects and music, in that in some of the tunes, you use sound effects as sort of percussive elements of the song.
Like I remember one of the mining levels, there's this really metallic kind of industrial sound that when you first play the level, you think it's the background sound effect. It's actually part of the music. I thought that was really effective.
Yeah, I think, again, that was another way of getting around some of the limitations of only having 8 notes of polyphony that you have to share with sound effects. So if you can incorporate some of the ambience into the music, then you can use that musically rather than having it taken away from your score.
Right.
So it was a solution to the limitation of the SNES rather than and again, it's a fun way of using instruments as well. If you've got like little birdie sounds in key firing off and being part of the rhythm, that's a great way to use it. And again, with the mines having those anvils and stuff cracking off in time, and then you can build the rhythm with that. Then using that as the rhythm and the ambience, you can concentrate your melodies accordingly.
Yeah, it's just brilliant. The last technical thing I wanted to ask you about the Donkey Kong Country games on the Super Nintendo is I feel like a lot of the tracks have like this lush reverb that's present on all of the samples. Was there a reverb setting that you could use on the Super Nintendo?
I think there was reverb, but we didn't use it because it didn't sound very convincing. Instead, we used delay. I think there was a little delay thing on there, a very basic delay.
Okay.
But most of it was done by doubling or tripling up channels.
Right, kind of like how you did on the NES.
Yeah, very much so. So the experience from there was adapted for the Super NES. So you might have and again, if you listen carefully to the soundtracks, we'd start off with perhaps a single instrument with lots of little delays on it, and we'd get a pattern going.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you bring in other instruments, the delays would disappear, but because people have got used to it, you don't notice that the bits that made it nice in singularity have disappeared, so you can bring in other elements. And that was used a lot. So yeah, I found that if you made a single instrument sound as good as possible and threw as much processing on it as you possibly could at the beginning, then when you had to take away those elements by bringing in other instruments, on the whole, we didn't notice.
That's so great. Now, we've talked so much about limitations and the challenges of working with that nowadays archaic technology. Was it fun for you to move on to something like the GameCube with Star Fox Adventures, where I would assume you'd have less limitations? Was that fun for you, or was it still a challenge working on that system?
I think that was. We've been working on the N64, it sounded very nice. It had a very good sound utility on there, and it sounded nice and warm and very good. When we moved to the GameCube, we had to use, I think it was a system called Factor 5 or something similar like that. And due to the way they wanted to do the game, it meant most of it had to be done with MIDI, and we only had 16 megs to share between the music and the sound effects. And the Factor 5 didn't have any global parameters. Everything had to be done in singularity. So if you were using multi-samples, you had to go through and change everything on every single multi-sample throughout an instrument. It was probably more work than the N64 was, and it really shouldn't have been.
That's so interesting. It feels like that always follows you with no matter the rise in technology, you always are facing those limitations. That's so interesting.
Certainly on the GameCube, I found that very... we could have done it differently, and perhaps in retrospect, we we might have done that. But the decision was made that we were going to use MIDI. There are advantages to using MIDI because when we're doing some of the game integration, then you have control over that and you can give callbacks to the game to trigger animations and certain gameplay elements. So, yeah, it was a balance of what we could use. But I found the GameCube very challenging. Took a lot of time to get something to sound warm, really. I thought, because on the game we did Star Fox Adventures, and I
Right.
much preferred, for me personally, the soundtrack on the N64. To me, it sounded just warmer to listen to and
Right.
more pleasing. On whatever sound utility they were using on the GameCube, it was very compromising.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, we got there. I mean, fortunately for the cutscenes, we could use a more integrated score because that was being streamed, so we could create that using. Well, I used Cubase at the time,
Hmm.
and that's what did most of the cutscenes. But yeah, the actual in-game stuff was all done using MIDI.
So nowadays, when you're working on something for like the Wii U, is a lot of it primarily just recordings, and that you're just putting WAV files or MP3 files, or is it still some of those limitations that you've worked with in the past?
No, it's moved on substantially since then. We can use as many stems as we need, really. And I'm using a lot of virtual instruments from Native Instruments and Steinberg and various different sources. So there's a lot more freedom and the ability to have sounds that sound a little more convincing.
Right.
The trick there is, or the technical challenges there are recreating some of the things that we used to do to keep the timing of the animations and things in sync with the game. But it's all very, very possible. So a lot of the restrictions have gone, which is very liberating.
Absolutely. Well, one thing I'm curious about is being a video game composer, it's so fundamentally different than composing for any other medium because the technology aspect is so ever present. And as you move from one console to the next, you have advancements. And in a way, I must have imagined it would be challenging, even like how you mentioned for the GameCube, learning all these new systems for every console you get to. How have you sort of adapted to that over the years? And what's that like? Becoming accustomed to one sound chip and then moving on to another one and having to relearn that.
It's always been very much the part of the course, really. You just know you're going to have to do it, so you get on and do it. So there's no big hardship.
Hmm.
It's just, in some ways, it's exciting seeing what you can do
Hmm.
with a new set of tools and a new sound system and exploring it to see what we can get out of it.
Right.
So yeah, I always found that part of it very interesting.